All right. Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you to the folks at IPPA for inviting me, especially Reb, David, Jenny for doing all that you've done to set up today's call, and to all of you who've called in to listen to the presentation and hopefully participate with your questions. And so, in thinking about what to prepare or to talk about for today, I thought I would do a brief presentation of the two areas of my research that I'm most passionate about, and that has to do with how we think about the meaning of work, and also how do we think about the way that people craft the jobs they're in so that they can change the meaning they make of that work and also change or shape the identity that they have in the job. And that sounds very, very vague, and so it's probably best to start with a story. This is a story that some of you may be familiar with, but I want to go back to the study where we first had, we being Jane Dutton at the University of Michigan and myself, first had some of the key insights into what was happening around the ways in which people were shaping the meaning of their own work. So the story starts with a study that we did of a university hospital cleaning crew. This was at a large Midwestern University hospital, and the study was quite simple. We selected at random people who worked in the hospital cleaning various spaces, patient rooms, public areas, and so on. And we interviewed them and observed them to ask essentially about how it was that they experienced the meaning of their work. And in the literature that I come from in psychology and in sociology, the prevailing wisdom to that point had been that one of the ways that the meaning of the work that they did would be informed was by the design of the job. So what did the tasks involve? How many interactions were they likely to be having with various groups and so on? And that regardless of the person in the job, you could map the structure of the job and learn a lot about how meaningful it would be, how motivating it would be, and so on. And Jane Dutton and Gulai Debeba, who was also part of the research team, and I felt that we weren't necessarily so sure that it would be such a unilateral take on the meaning of this job. And so we went in and did interviews and observations. And what we found was a great deal of variance with respect to how the cleaning crew members talked about the meaning of their work. So some of them talked about it in the way that the literature would have expected. So saying, well, you know, it's just a job and I'm here for the benefits and I don't particularly enjoy it. And also that they didn't see it as being a particularly skilled job. And this was quite in contrast to another group of people on the cleaning crew who talked about the work in far more positive terms. And so they talked about it as being meaningful, something that they enjoyed. They described all kinds of things that they did as part of the job. They described the job as being quite skilled. And when we asked everyone a question about, well, what is your role here at the university hospital? The cleaners in the first group who talked about the work in ways that we might have expected gave their full sort of job title as would appear on their pay stub. And the second group, instead of giving that job title, which was their job title as well, would say things like, well, I'm an ambassador for the hospital. And in the most extreme case said, I'm a healer. And when we would ask them to describe what it was they meant by that, they would say things like, well, I'm here to do whatever I can to help patients and their families with their experiences at the hospital. And so this was fascinating to us, and we decided to dig deeper because it's possible that this was just two groups of people with a very different way of talking about doing exactly the same thing. And as we dug into the data and their descriptions about what it was they did on the job, we realized that something fascinating was happening. They were doing completely different jobs, though the organization was not aware of it, though they were actually not permitted to be doing two totally different jobs. The group that described the work in more stereotypical terms described the job exactly as it existed in the job description. And so they talked about cleaning patient rooms. They did not talk much about interacting with others. In fact, they were told not to seek out interactions with patients and visitors, but instead to be kind if they were asked a question of. Whereas the second group described all kinds of tasks that they saw as part of their job that involved caring for patients, trying to help their families in any way that they could, moving through the hospital space into spaces they weren't allowed to be in to guide family members back to their cars and so on, paying attention as they were doing their cleaning to see if there were patients who didn't seem to have had a visitor in quite some time and seemed upset, so that they could double back and spend time with that patient after they had finished the set of rooms they were responsible for, and so on and so forth. And so this was fascinating to us, and suggested that more than just reframing how they thought about what the job entailed, that these two groups of cleaners were doing completely different jobs. And in what's maybe one of the most well-known examples from this particular study, one of the people we interviewed talked about working on the long-term rehabilitation floor of the hospital, where patients were emerging from comas and hopefully sort of getting better and moving to rehabilitation facilities over a period of weeks or months. And talked about, as part of the job that she did, that she would take paintings down from their walls and rearrange them on a periodic basis. And when we asked why it was that she did this, she explained that it was her hope that maybe some difference or change in the environment of the patients, though they were unresponsive, might help to spark something in them and make something sort of happen in their healing sooner. And when we asked her if this was something that was part of her duties as someone who worked on that unit, the answer was very clear. What she said in response to that question was, that's not part of my job, but that's part of me. And so this speaks to the other piece that we think about when we think about this particular study and all of the research that it's given rise to, that in addition to changing the job that they were doing and the kinds of tasks they were involved in and the interactions that they were having with nurses, with clerks, with family members around how to best support the patients and deliver the best possible care, there were, in addition to changes in the meaning in the work, changes in how people thought about their identity and how much of their identity they were able to bring into the work or enact in the job through the way that they did it. And this was, for us, revelatory, though obviously people are doing this all the time in any number of different jobs that they have. But we became fascinated in studying the structure of this activity, and in trying to come up with a way to describe what was happening that we couldn't explain through simple things like how long had they worked at the hospital, what kind of units did they work on, what shift did they work, were they men or women, how much interaction did their job entail, meaning how busy were the units they were on. None of the things that we could point to as potential structural explanations for why we would see these differences emerge explained the difference. And so we dug into this further and started talking about the ways in which they were crafting their jobs. And so when we say job crafting, I want to be clear about how it is we're thinking about this. We've defined it together with our colleague and co-author Justin Berg at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania as what employees do to redesign their own jobs in ways that foster engagement at work, job satisfaction, resilience, and thriving. And so the way that we think about this and have defined it, in addition to being about sort of this general activity, we've specified different ways in which employees do this. So for example, the first form of job crafting that interests us has to do with task crafting. So how is it that employees are altering the number or the type or the nature of the tasks that they do as part of their jobs? And I want to be careful here to point something out, and that is in the way that I've talked about the study of the cleaning crew, it can seem as though this is just about sort of adding in additional tasks or additional things that you're doing in the work. And I want to be clear that it can also mean sort of minimizing or stripping out those tasks that are not supportive of the kind of meaning that you want to make of the work or the kind of identity that you want to enact in the work to the extent possible. So I also want to be quite practical that there are things that that have to be done in any job. And the cleaners, for example, were well aware of the fact that every space they were responsible for needed to be cleaned each shift. But beyond that, were there things that they could spend less time on that they could do or engage in a different way? that's how we define task crafting. The second form is relational crafting, and this has to do with how employees will alter the number, the type, the intensity of the relationships that they have on the job with coworkers, with members of the organization, with clients or customers, or how they change the style of the interactions that they have with those individuals or groups. So, for example, you could think of someone who works in a marketing function at an organization, thinking about the interactions that he or she is having with people from the research and development R&D arm of that organization as being sort of perhaps difficult, full of conflict about when products are going to be developed and ready to ship and so on, to think about instead how might a different set of relationships get formed with that group so that this becomes a source of positivity in the work. And then finally, we talk about cognitive crafting, and this we define as how people alter the way that they perceive their tasks and their meaning. So for example, if you think of someone who works in IT or information technology, they could perhaps frame the work that they do as being about responding to help desk tickets and requests and problems sort of all day long. Or they could think about the work as being an opportunity to engage with and perhaps teach the people in the organization they're working with at every opportunity when they have a problem to troubleshoot, to not just fix the problem, but to teach the person who's had the problem about why it is it happened in the first place so that they could potentially avoid the problem in the future. And so in that sense, the job shifts from being simply about being a troubleshooter or a goalie to being something that's more about being a teacher of or supporter of others, which our argument is to the extent that that speaks to the kind of meaning someone would like to make of their work, can be an extremely powerful reframe. And so in thinking about this activity or this practice of job crafting, what's happened has been rather exciting in that this work has continued both in work that I've done with my colleagues, but also studies that have been taking place elsewhere as well. And so in thinking about what we know from, I've at the bottom of this slide put just a few studies, there are many more. Why is it that we think job crafting matters? Well, we know now from the work that's been done in this area that it influences what work is getting done, how it's getting done, when it's getting done, and with whom the work is done, which again is quite a bit different from just changing how one thinks about the work. This has a material effect on the organization because it's changing what's actually happening on the ground among employees, which we think makes it interesting both from the point of view of thinking about individuals' experience of their work, but also makes it very interesting for organizations to study what it is that's happening in the evolution of work in their firms. Second, it's prevalent in work organizations. We find all kinds of examples in the published literature, but also in the kinds of occupations people are now studying to look at job crafting, in positions where people have ostensibly very little power or status or expertise in the organization, so those conditions where you would expect the least amount of job crafting, you see plenty of job crafting happening all the way up to the top of the organization where people ought to have a great deal of discretion. You also see a lot of job crafting as well. This is something that seems from our studies to be happening across the board, across sectors, across industries, and so on. And then finally, this sums up a point that I've already made, that it's critical, we feel, because it changes the meaning and the purpose of how people think about the work that they do. And this is where it ties into the second area of research that I'm most passionate about. And it's certainly an area that has gotten a lot more attention in the popular press and in just the public over the last several years, much to my astonishment and delight. And so this question of the meaning of work and doing meaningful work and how much do we care about that and how do we think about whether that matters, it certainly seems that society has become very interested in this. And usually when something like this happens, you see it reflected in the popular press and in books. And certainly whether you're talking about special issues of periodicals, whether you're talking about books or or edited collections that have been brought together, there's more and more and more all the time being written about meaningful work, thinking about the role of work in life, and so on. And as a researcher, my thought anytime a question like this comes into the mainstream and begins to get a lot of attention is to wonder and hope that there is research that would underpin the assumption that's being made that there are actual areas in which this kind of thing is really having an impact. And so I'm happy to report that this question of whether meaningful work really matters has been answered resoundingly in the literature. And so meaningful work and or the meaning of work, and I'll differentiate those in a moment, has been shown to influence or be associated with a number of key outcomes. So including work motivation, absenteeism from work, people's behaviors at work, their engagement with the work they do, their satisfaction with work, how empowered they feel in their work, their stress at work, their identification with the organizations they work for, their career development trajectories, their performance at work, and how fulfilled they feel in the work that they do. So there's plenty of evidence and more evidence amassing every quarter from the research front around meaningful work being something that really matters quite a bit. And at this point, I want to sort of point out a differentiation that I want to make because it's a differentiation that sparked my initial entry into doing research in this area. And so I'll try hard to make this concrete and not too fuzzy and conceptual, but it's a distinction that I think is pretty clear and also one that's quite important. So to set it up before I move to the next slide, I will say this. When I started doing research in this area and became interested in how people thought about the meaning of their work, I started to look through the literature for the ways in which this got measured by researchers. And what I found was that not always, but often, the way that this got captured was in measures that tried to assess how important did people feel work was in their life, or how central was it to their identity or to their experience. How much involvement did they have with the work that they did or with their job. And while those kinds of measures are incredibly helpful, they talk more about how deeply people are tied to the domain of work, but they don't talk about why or what kind of meaning is that involvement based on. And so in the early work that I've done in this area, I've tried to leverage this difference between meaning and meaningfulness to spark interest in moving the field in a bit of a different direction around this. And so I've been focused on meaning. And by meaning, what I'm talking about is the output of having made sense of something, or what it is that it signifies, as in someone interpreting what her work means or the role her work plays in the context of life. So the meaning, I would argue, has more to do with the what. Are you working because work is a paycheck? Are you working because your work represents a higher calling? Are you working because it's just something to do? Is work something that represents more of an oppression to you? Or is it something else entirely? And that I see as being distinct from questions of meaningfulness, which have to do with the amount of significance that something holds for the individual. So this second category is, I think, tapped by a lot of the earlier research that looked at how central, involving, important, and so on work was for individuals. I think that regardless of the kind of meaning work has, it can be very meaningful across different types of meaning, but that there's insight to be gained by understanding the type of meaning people make of their work in addition to the amount of meaningfulness their work holds for them. So I hope that distinction is clear because, and I'm happy to take questions later if it's not, because it gave way for, sort of opened the way for the initial research that I did in this area with my collaborators to try to think about, well, if we want to take this idea of different kinds of meanings seriously, how might we begin to understand that. And so the way in which we did this was to borrow from work that Robert Bellah and his colleagues had done in their landmark book, Habits of the Heart, published in 1985, and work that had been subsequently also written about by Roy Baumeister and others, in which work was presented in the Bellah book as being a domain of life that people either experienced as a job, as a career, or as a calling. And together with my colleagues on this project, so Paul Rosen, Barry Schwartz, and Rick McCauley, we were interested in trying to understand as psychologists whether these distinctions, first of all, sort of made any sense to people from a psychological standpoint, whether it would be possible to measure people's orientations toward the work they had as a job, career, or calling, and whether these distinctions would matter for things that we care about with respect to people's experience of their work and their well-being. And so to briefly walk through the way that we've defined the different orientations, you can think about a job orientation as one that is primarily focused on work as income. So for people who have a strong job orientation, the work primarily represents a means to a financial end that is used to support one's family, one's life outside of work, sort of other kinds of projects and so on. And so you see a sample item that we've used in the measure that we've developed in which we ask people, if you were financially secure, would you continue with your current work even if you were no longer paid? And this is quite in contrast with the second orientation, which they call and we call a career orientation, in which the primary focus is on advancing in the occupation that you're in, with all of the accompanying increases in prestige and power and status and so on that come along with that. And so for people with a career orientation, they're not so much focused on work as a means to a financial end as they are as a way to move up either within or between organizations in some field or area that they've entered so that they can advance and ascend to the greatest degree possible. And here again you see a sample item that we've used to study this orientation. And then the last orientation, which is the one that has probably, not to my great surprise, but sort of how much interest it's gotten has been surprising to me, is the calling orientation. And so here we're talking about this in a secular sense, though obviously the concept of calling has deep religious roots that my colleagues Jeff Thompson and Stuart Bunderson have written terrific work on. Here, the way that they and we have defined callings is that rather than working for financial gain or for career advancement, people who see their work as a calling see the work as an end in itself, as opposed to a means to some other end. And so they're working for the fulfillment that the work itself brings to the individual. And the other thing that we have found is that people who see their work as a calling see the work as contributing to the world in some way. That's true whether or not you and I would look at that job and see it as something that contributes to making the world a better place. The thing that seems to matter here is how the individual frames the meaning of the work that they're doing. And so in our initial work on this, so this is research that goes back some time now, what we find is that, to my surprise, people are more unambiguous than I would have expected in reporting that they see their work as a job, a career, or a calling. And I should point out that in the items that we've developed for our measure, we're never asking people, is this just a job for you? Is this your calling? In part because we think those kinds of questions are perhaps normatively loaded in a way that might make them difficult or leading to answer. And so we've focused on creating a scale that instead tries to tap the thoughts, the feelings, and behaviors that would accompany each of these orientations. And so in the initial paper that we did with, again, Paul Rosen, Barry Schwartz, and Rick McCauley, we found that our samples split about a third, and a third into each of these different orientations with respect to which one was primary for people. The other thing that we found was that these orientations were associated with differences in people's behaviors at work and their work and life satisfaction, such that for those who viewed the work primarily as a job or primarily as a career, they tended to work fewer hours, miss more days of work, and report significantly lower job and life satisfaction than those who primarily viewed their work as a calling. And what was to us sort of fascinating, and this really inspired for me a lot more interest in and work on this subject, is that we found this pattern both across and within occupations and organizations, such that if we identified, and which we did in this initial paper, and isolated a group of people who worked for the same organization in the same job at roughly the same level of pay, same level of education, and so on. And we found the same patterns held even within that group. So even when you were controlling for the kind of work people were doing, people saw it as either a job, a career, or a calling, and that they differed in the same ways than people did across the whole sample. And this, for me, was fascinating to try to understand where it is that these orientations come from, how is it that they express themselves, how might they matter for individuals and for organizations. And the other sort of piece that I want to add here is that subsequent work done by Justin Berg, Adam Grant, and Victoria Johnson has found that people who feel that they have a calling to do something but are unable to pursue that calling will often try to craft elements of whatever job they're in to be somewhat more aligned with that calling, and that the inability to do that can give rise to a sense of regret. And so before I move back to job crafting, I just want to say a little bit more about some of our general findings in this area. So of the three different work orientations of job, career, and calling. So what we find across a number of samples is that work orientation is related to age. It is the case that the older people are, the more likely they are to see their work as a calling. What's interesting to me about this is that we don't know what the cause of this effect is. And there are a number of contenders that I find fascinating and that I would like to study sort of going forward. So for one, it could be that it's just a simple cognitive dissonance effect where the longer you've worked at something, the more comfortable it is to think, well, I really must love this. I've been doing it so long. And so people may start to come to think of what they do as a calling for that reason. It may also be the case that as people advance through life, that they take jobs or craft jobs in such a way that they more and more closely approximate something that for them is a calling as they move through time, which would also explain the correlation. It may also be the case that it's a life course development phenomenon, that as people get older, they become more focused on generativity, sort of giving back, their impact on others, and so on. And so it's possible that it's just a life course phenomenon, and that this is part of what's driving it. There's been a lot of interest in generational differences in the workplace, and so perhaps the most cynical view is that it's the older and sort of maybe the greatest generations that are more called than the younger generations, and it's that effect. I somehow doubt that that's it. And so I look forward to sort of living long enough to do a long enough study to tap some better answers on that. Calling orientation also tends to be associated with income and with education. Again, though, when you control for income, education, sort of type of job, and so on, what you find are exactly the same patterns that I've just described. So I don't think that this is just a income and education effect. Interestingly, people who view their work as a calling tend to think that the work is more prestigious, that their occupation has more prestige than the general public does in National Opinion Research Center ratings of occupational prestige. Again, as I said before, work and life satisfaction tend to be related to work orientation such that those with callings have more of it. People with callings as well have less absenteeism from work than those with jobs and careers. And then finally, job search outcomes are also related to this. And if you think about this, it makes sense. For someone who's searching for a new job, if work is just a job, then a job search is primarily a problem of replacing an income stream. This is quite different from someone who has a calling, who is engaging in a job search, where the kind of work that they will be doing is going to be paramount and possibly even more important than aspects of sort of salary and perks of the job and so on. Whereas those with careers are likely to be most focused on not losing position or ground in the field that they're in as they move from one organization to another. And data that we have suggests that these relationships bear out. And so I want to transition back for a moment to, and for the rest of our time, to job crafting for the following reason, is that if you think about these orientations, a potential risk is to think about them as these kind of fixed buckets that people sort of live their work lives in. And given the research that we've done on job crafting, I don't want to suggest that this is the case. In fact, I think that job crafting creates a path to meaningful work. Meaningful work being work that taps the kind of meaning, the type of meaning that people hold most dear and most want to realize in the work that they do. And so, again, in job crafting, I think there's a lot of promising potential to move beyond just trying to frame the work differently. I think that is certainly a powerful intervention, but it's not as powerful as actually changing how it is you do the work and the job that you're in. I think that job crafting has, as I've said before, serious implications for how people engage in their work, and it focuses them on their behaviors at work as well as the thoughts or the frame that they have on the meaning of their work. And so a question that you might be wondering about, and in fact I hope you are, is in thinking about job crafting, this is something that has the potential to be certainly good for employees, but not necessarily good for organizations. So you can imagine someone who's altering the boundaries of their job, the task and relational and cognitive boundaries of the job, doing it in ways that would delight the organization, that make them far more effective, that make them a more engaged employee. Or you could imagine a situation where someone who is feeling burnt out, who starts minimizing sort of the scope of their tasks, pulling back from interactions and relationships on the job, might have a negative impact on the organization through their crafting. And certainly in the theoretical work that I've done with Jane Dutton on this, we are very open to the possibility that the implications for organizations could be rather complex. And so I've been very interested to see in answering this question of whether job crafting is good or bad for organizations, that research that's been done across a number of contexts now, education, sales, telemarketing, manufacturing, nonprofits, and so on, that job crafting seems to be related to several positive outcomes. So for example, satisfaction with work, commitment to the work, attachment to the job, engagement in the work, performance on the job. I think this is, again, sort of very encouraging, just in the same way that I found it encouraging to think about the ways in which orientations differed across jobs, but also within jobs. But the work that's been done in this area has tended to go into organizations and look at how people are currently enacting their jobs. And so you're finding, if you will, sort of job crafting in the wild. And I've given this image here of this water droplet on a leaf, that you're sort of finding it in nature kind of as it's happening, and then finding these associations with these positive effects. But what's difficult about that is to understand, well, what came first? Is it that the people who are satisfied, committed, attached to the job, highly engaged and performing well, do crafting, or is it that crafting actually gives rise to these effects? And so in other work that I've done with colleagues, we've been interested in trying to, rather than studying things as they happen, to actually intervene in a system and introduce job crafting to see how it influences both individuals and the organizations they work in. And so what we have found, this is work that I've done again with Justin Berg, Adam Grant, both at the University of Pennsylvania, Jennifer Kurkowski and Brian Welly, both of Google. What we found is that introducing job crafting creates several positive outcomes. So it creates more happiness at work, it creates better performance at work, it also increases mobility to new roles in the organization, and this is happiness and performance as judged by coworkers and managers who who knew that employees were part of a study but didn't know necessarily that they were job crafting. So this wasn't something where there would have been very strong demand effects on saying, well, they're performing better now that they're doing their job in a different way. So we find this to be very encouraging evidence that we're continuing to follow up on, that introducing job crafting in organizational systems seems to be good for individuals, but also seems to be good for organizations as well. And so in thinking about the implications of this, and then how might organizations actually leverage what's possible with job crafting in terms of how it can shape the meaning that people derive from their work, we feel that this work changes our understanding of the sources of meaningfulness. So both those sources that are inherent in the job that people have, the jobs that people hold, inherent in themselves and the kinds of meaning that they wish to make of the work, and especially at the intersection. How do people, with the desires that they have to engage in their work in different ways, make that happen by changing how it is that they've actually structured the job? We also feel that it suggests a more stable source and set of practices for facilitating meaningfulness in work. So there are a lot of organizational efforts to make organizations sites of meaning for individuals, that belongingness is something that's very positive, that the organization is engaging in exciting things, and that will boost the sense of meaning people have in their work. But if you look at the number of changes that people are likely to have in their employers over the course of a career, I wonder if that is in fact as stable a source of meaning as is thinking about the work itself that the individual does, that belongs to the individual in a different way. And so through job crafting and through thinking about work meaning in the way that we've studied it, we're hoping to help understand a more portable agentic enactment of work that sits with the worker rather than is under the control of the organization. And so ways that organizations could potentially seed job crafting, first would be to boost the autonomy and the support that individuals have to do their work. So there's a whole spate of studies in the literature that show that increasing employee autonomy and the support that they have to use that autonomy yields positive effects. It would also, I would argue, make it more likely that job crafting would take hold. In addition, building developmental plans with employees could be a powerful way to do this. So in addition to regular annual performance evaluations, there are also a lot of opportunities that organizations have, and some of them take these opportunities, to build a developmental plan for employees. So what is it that you're looking to do over the next year? What skills are you looking to develop? What kinds of projects do you want to be involved in? This is a natural place to try to help the employee articulate, well, what is it that you're interested in with respect to crafting the job as you go forward. It's also possible by communicating strategic goals to help employees attach the kind of crafting they want to do to those things that matter most to the organization. And so the more that managers and leaders can articulate what it is the organization is moving toward, what it is that's being emphasized in the coming period, it gives employees an exciting opportunity to think about, well, how could I do my job differently in a way that speaks to those goals? And then finally, the last way that I would suggest possibly doing this is to hold job crafting swap meets. So in work that we've been doing looking at this, and more recent work that's been published just a few months ago by colleagues of mine overseas, what we find is that collaborative job crafting, in which people are crafting their jobs together, which gives opportunities for you to give tasks to me that you don't particularly like, but that I find much more engaging, and vice versa, is another way in which you can think about the usefulness of job crafting for individuals and organizations. And so a final thought that I'll close with is, I think if, given my interest in meaning, or engagement at work and all the rest, if you want to think about the most powerful way to signal a commitment to employees' sense of purpose and meaning, I think the answer that's pointed to by the kind of work I've been doing is probably no surprise, and that is that you celebrate and support their ownership of it. And so with that, I'll stop, and David, I'll turn it over to you and any questions that might have come in.
That's awesome. Amy, thank you so much. If we had the lines open, you'd hear applause from all of us who are working and in whatever role in life, paid or unpaid. Your presentation is so empowering. As you say, you're not putting it on the organizations. You're suggesting how organizations can create a more encouraging environment for job crafting, but really giving us the opportunity, the power to make it happen on our own. So that's really very exciting. So thank you. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. It was fun to share the work. I hope it was clear.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a couple questions that have come in, and well, I have one fun one which I'll save for just a moment. Kathy Parson asked a question, and which is a very interesting one, and that is, do you think that if a person tries to recraft their job to create more meaning and it fails, that they could be more vulnerable to burnout? Is there any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. So this is not something that I have studied empirically, so I'm speculating here. I do think that there is benefit in the attempt, in that it's the realization that you have agency to enact sort of aspects of your job in a different way, that I think goes some of the distance to driving some of the effects that are being found in this area. That said, attempts to craft that are ultimately not successful, I do think would raise the likelihood of exit from the organization or from the role, could possibly increase the likelihood that someone would become disengaged from the role that they're in. And, again, sort of thinking about the individual and their own health, if that kind of move was possible, I don't know that that would be a bad thing, for them to sort of realize that though they want to craft the role they're in, that it's not possible and that they would probably be better off in a different kind of role. The other thing I'll say in response to that is there's a job crafting exercise that I've developed with Justin Berg and Jane Dutton that has now been taken by probably now more than 10,000 people. And one of the things that's quite promising, and again, sort of, we weren't sure how the extent to which this would be the case, is that even in jobs where it ought to be pretty impossible for someone to craft how it is they're doing the work in a different way, that people are ingenious about the subtle things that they can do, often without the notice of management, to engage the work in a different way that brings more meaning to them. And so I'll go back for a moment to the example of the cleaning crew. The management in the organization was completely unaware that they were doing any of these things. And the people we interviewed, I think, without sort of talking about it this way, my sense is that they knew to keep it under the radar, and that as long as they were hitting the kinds of things that they were responsible for, that they had more agency than outsiders might have thought, to change aspects of how it is they did the job. So my hope would be that there would be some way to craft the work, but that would be my response, in the case that it was impossible to actually carry off.
That's excellent. Very good. Thank you. Scott Crabtree asked a question, and that is, and a couple of people actually requested the same, is if you could point to more detail about how a job crafting swap meet would work.
Okay, I'd be happy to. So this is something that we've done with technology firms. There's a paper, and David, I can send this to you if it's a resource that you can put on the site, that was just published, looking at a call center that in the experiences that I've had, what we've done is we've done the job crafting exercise, which again is at www.jobcrafting.org if you're interested in checking out the exercise. What we've done is we've taken intact groups from organizations, so people who work together interdependently, and had them go through the exercise as a group. And so each person is, for example, mapping out the job that they have sort of as they currently do it with respect to their tasks and interactions and relationships and so on. And when it comes time in the exercise to think about what would be a more ideal but still realistic version of this job that would better deploy the kinds of involvement, tasks, interactions, and so on that would speak to the kind of meaning that people want to make of the work they're in, that they're talking about that as a group, and that they're realizing that in some cases there are tasks or interactions that some people are looking to minimize or drop if they could from their plate, that others would be happy to take on more of because they find that part of the job or that part of the function of the group to be more meaningful. The risk, of course, with this is that there may be tasks or interactions that get identified by the group that no one wants, that everyone is looking to minimize or drop. And in the particular case where that I'm thinking of, the organization very smartly sort of anticipated this and communicated with employees that if there were implications of this sort, that the organization would think about how might they potentially outsource some of that work or structure it in such a way that it was sort of minimally impactful in a negative way on the group.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. I'm telling you, we're going to wish we had more time with you, but we're going to keep going with the questions. Irene Nazaro asks, what might be the best way to broach, with your experience, Amy, best way to broach the subject of job crafting with a superior so to really gain their support and not consider it in any negative way?
Okay, so I think it's a terrific question. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I want to be very upfront about this, is that in having people do the job crafting exercise and then talk about, what this means in terms of going back into their organizations and enacting this job in a different way, I've heard at various points people say, I can't wait to take this and show this to my manager. And other people saying, the last person I will show this to would be my manager, with very different understandings of what the likely level of support is in their context. And I want to be realistic that obviously levels of support around this are likely to differ, and that the employee's discretion about whether you just kind of go on doing what you're doing, but do it in a way that suits you better. Again, in the study that I've reported, what we find is that even blind to the condition of the study that our participants were in, their managers and coworkers saw improved performance over time. If you are looking to enroll your manager or supervisor in your plans to get his or her support around what it is that you're trying to do, I think a conversation about those aspects of the job that you most enjoy, that you most find meaningful, and that you would like to really do even more of in a way that you can see benefiting the organization in some way, that yoking the kind of plans that you have for crafting, even if it's pulling back from interactions or tasks that are more negative for you, the net benefit of this, we theorize and find, is that your engagement in the work is going to be greater, your sense of meaning in the work is going to be greater. That's good for the organization given the performance effects that we've found. If you can tie it to what the potential effect would be for the organization, if that's necessary, given whatever kind of manager you might have, that's probably one way to make a strong case. But again, for people who are very worried about getting managerial resistance to this, I've been surprised at how many people have just started doing the job in a different way and finding that everything went quite smoothly and that their managers weren't necessarily aware of all of the things that they have changed.
That's exciting, very encouraging once again. Great advice. Natalia Pestalozzi has a real good question too. Suggestions, do you have suggestions for entrepreneurs? And from the perspective of they are often initially forced to do many things, and some of those things don't play to their strengths or even their interests. And even though so they want to build their business, but in the beginning they really have to kind of wear all hats. Do you have thoughts on how job crafting would apply there?
So I think when you don't really have a lot of discretion around what is on your plate, which is how I would code a situation like that, you have to do marketing, you have to do fundraising, you have to do operations. Chances are probably slim, I agree, that every one of those things is as engaging as the other if you're a single individual doing them all. If you can't move things off of your plate or find other members of your team, if you have a team, to delegate those to, and it's just you as a sole proprietor. What I have found has been effective for people has been to think about how do they order the tasks or the interactions in there either within a day or within a week. in ways that leverage the energy and the enthusiasm and the engagement they get from the things that they like most to then help carry them through the things that are less meaningful or motivating for them. And so for some people that has meant on Mondays, kind of holding their nose and taking their medicine and just driving through the things that they don't enjoy as much so that they've then cleared the way for the rest of the day or the rest of a week to engage in the things that they really enjoy. Others have found the opposite has been effective for them, that if they always put at the beginning of each day or each week a meeting with funders or working on an operational problem, whatever it is that's most engaging for them, that it really boosts their energy and helps them sort of carry through the less palatable tasks.
That's excellent. Super. We have more questions than we can even handle, but let's try and squeeze another one in. Karina from Melbourne, and we've had these questions have been coming in from lots of different places around the world, which is really cool. And we thank all the people from around the world who are up early or up late or in the middle of their day. This question comes from Karina, and she says, is job crafting less likely after multiple restructurings?
Empirically, I do not know. We've not studied that. I think that following multiple restructurings, given that those tend to be times of more ambiguity and anxiety in organizations, that it's potentially an opportunity to leverage that ambiguity and to think about, well, what is it that needs to be done in the organization that one would most sort of enjoy doing that perhaps is being underattended to by the organization, and to kind of cut to the open space or move into the space that would make that happen. Of course, that's likely to be countered by the great deal of anxiety that tends to be present in organizations after multiple restructurings, but it's potentially an opportunity in the rough. And I'll just say that in pilot work that I'm working on currently around job crafting, when we look at accounts of things that people have reported they've done in crafting their jobs, sometimes these things have been moves that they've made in their work under periods of great ambiguity where they felt like there was a better way to do something, and that these were often, over a longer period of time, moves that got solidified or sort of formalized by the organization because the organization could see the value in doing the work that way. And so I'd be hopeful, unless the climate is so negative based on the restructurings that everyone's just in a duck and cover kind of situation.
Tremendous. Amy, I told you before the call started, people are passionate about this, of your work, and so they would love for us to continue, and unfortunately we're coming close to the top of the hour. So I saved the fun question for last. This means you're really important, Amy, because early in my experience with positive psychology, dating back to when I was at Yahoo and early on, there was all this question about how do you pronounce Mike Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's name? And now the question has come, how, and so I thought I'd save this for last, how do you best suggest people remember how to say your last name?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. It's a name that you're better off hearing before you see it. And the mnemonic that I use is, I had an uncle who used to call me Pesky Wrzesniewski. So it rhymes with pesky, if that helps. And I'm honored that you even mentioned me in the same breath as Csikszentmihalyi. So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. I got a kick out of that when I saw that come in, and it came in a couple ways. So, Amy Wrzesniewski, thank you so much for presenting today. Again, we just love to have you. Thank you so much.